Impressive group. You are all the best to find your way here past 6 o'clock on a weeknight. And I'm Megan Heffernan. I teach English at DePaul. And I'm one of the co-chairs with Francesca Royster of our visiting speaker series. So we're kind of reconstituting ourselves mid-pandemic, and we're back. And we're really excited about the event tonight. I'm not really going to say much about tonight, but I am going to preview one tiny little event upcoming on May 14th. That's a Friday at 6 p.m. And it's a really exciting conversation between two of our alumni. So it's Jana Slor and Jessica Tiarella, who will be in conversation together about their books, their recently published books, and plans for writing in the future. And that's also, I'll just point out, the evening of the English Department Spring Conference. So it will be a kind of lovely bookend to that event. So without much, I'm sorry about the cat, it's her dinner time. Without much more ado, I'm going to pass things over to Francesca, but I will pop back up at the end to moderate questions.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see your faces and cats and other things tonight. I'm so excited to introduce our guest, Professor Salamishah Tillet, the author of her new book, In Search of the Color Purple, The Story of an American Masterpiece. I am going to put right now in the chat a link where you can order a copy of the book from the DePaul bookstore. The copy is currently available and waiting for you. And did that work? I think so. And I just wanted to say before I give the full informal introduction to Professor Tillet that we've known each other for over a decade. I had the chance to work with and share ideas with Salamishah at the Callaloo Black Gathering, at least that's how it's called in my head, but kind of coming together of Black scholars and artists and folks and scholar artists, organized by Charles Rowell, who's the editor of Callaloo. And I was always struck by just the wonderful combination of warmth and humor, but also like really tenacious intellectual energy that Salamishah would bring to whatever we were talking about, and including her own work. And but also just like her style and her humor and her presence in the room, which it's too bad that we can't fully enjoy because we are not in the room together. But it's just a pleasure. It's been a pleasure to watch her work develop over these years, and her voice as a public intellectual, as a scholar, as an activist. It's so impressive to me, and that was one reason that I really wanted to invite her this year, because of the ways that she occupies all these different roles, and that always the timeliness of her work, and the incredible deep respect that she brings to her interrogation of African American literature and culture, whether it's in her scholarly work or in her kind of popular writing. So I thought she would be a great model for all of us too, as we're thinking about English, whether it's from a literary or from a creative writing perspective. And we were all really excited on the committee to that Salamishah said yes. So here we are. Okay, so let me read this introduction. Named by Gloria Steinem as one of the best contemporary feminist writers, Salamishah Tillet is the contributing critic at large for the New York Times, where she's been writing since 2015. She writes about popular culture, politics, gender, sexuality, and race, and before the Times wrote political and cultural commentary for The Nation and The Root. She is the author of course, In Search of the Color Purple, The Story of an American Masterpiece, which was just published this year by Abrams in 2021, and Sites of Slavery, Citizenship and Racial Democracy in the Post-Civil Rights Imagination, which was published by Duke University in 2012. In 2020, she was awarded the Whiting Foundation Creative Nonfiction Fellowship for her cultural memoir, All the Rage, Mississippi Goddamn, and the World Nina Simone Made. Currently, she's the Henry Rutgers Professor of Creative Writing and African American and African Studies at Rutgers University, Newark, and the founder of New Arts Justice at Express Newark, an initiative for feminist approaches for socially engaged art in the city of Newark and beyond. With her sister, she founded A Long Walk Home, an arts organization that empowers young people to end violence against girls and women. In 2020, she was a founding member of the Black Girl Freedom Fund, a 10-year initiative to invest $1 billion in the lives and livelihood of Black girls and young women and their families. She received her Bachelor of Arts in English and African American Studies and graduated Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania, her Master's of Art in Teaching in English from Brown University, and her Master's of Art in English and American Literature, and her PhD in American Studies from Harvard University. For her writing and activism, Salamishah has been awarded grants and fellowships from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, the Lindeck Foundation, the Novo Foundation, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Victoria Foundation, and the Whiting Foundation. And, as her website says, she loves chocolate and crime thrillers and currently lives in Newark, New Jersey with her 2 young children and her life partner, Solomon. So excited to hear Salamishah share her new work with us.
Well, first of all, I would just like to say thank you so much. I was like, where'd that introduction come from? And then I was from my website. So I was like, oh, wow, like there's a lot of different parts of me. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you, Francesca, for just being such a wonderful colleague. Your work and your writing have continuously inspired me, and you can hopefully see remnants of the kinds of interrogation that you do, whether it was your work on Cleopatra, and of course, your work on Grace Jones, which I constantly teach, continue to influence my project on Nina Simone. So I just want to say thank you. And then also to Anne Rousseau, who's on the call as well, or the presentation as well, for her organizing. More recently, a couple of years ago, I was in Chicago to do a project that looked at the intersections of gun violence, community violence, and state violence. And it was just really with Beth Ritchie and then with Scheherazade, and it was really just wonderful to be, I'm such an admirer of the activists in Chicago who constantly push against the institutional forces that oppress so many of us, but also do it in such really thoughtful coalitions. And so Anne's definitely one of them as well. So anyway, so thank you all for having me, and thank you for being here. So I'm just going to read an excerpt from the book, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. And I was saying earlier that this is my 30-year anniversary of reading The Color Purple. I read it for the first time, and so I'm going to begin with an excerpt that talks about that, and then talk about what the book has meant to me. So this is early on page 4 in the book. The first time I read The Color Purple, I was 15 years old and spending the summer in Boston with my dad, preparing to apply for early decision to the University of Pennsylvania. I had just been let go from my part-time canvassing gig at an environmental law center because my boss realized that I was too young to be knocking on people's doors well past dusk. Since it was too late for me to pick up another summer job, I ended up answering phones, sorting mail, and volunteering at the local NAACP office. During my breaks, I'd pick up the latest of the weekly books that my cousin's tall, light brown-skinned girlfriend, Nicole, gave me to read. She was only 2 years older than I was, but already an English major at Penn herself, and sensing that I was on the verge of an identity crisis, she felt obligated to help me build up my armor of African American literature. In turn, 3 books in particular determined my fate. Alex Haley's The Autobiography of Malcolm X, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, and Alice Walker's The Color Purple. By the time I returned home to New Jersey and to my suburban private high school that fall, I felt armed with a new vocabulary of racial pride and Black feminism. Walker's protagonist, Celie Harris, a dark brown-skinned African-American girl born in segregation, made the book all the more fascinating to me. Dear God, Celie opens the novel. I am 14 years old. I have always been a good girl. Maybe you can give me a sign letting me know what is happening to me. What Celie was unable to name was the fact that the man she called Pa repeatedly raped her, as her enfeebled mother wasted away in the next room. You better not tell nobody but God, he warns. It'll kill your mammy. By creating a protagonist who was a victim of racism and repeated rapes, and also a figure who eventually was able to break her silence and tell her story on her own terms, Walker turned Celie into one of the most original characters in all of literature. I've gone back to The Color Purple many times since that summer of 1991, after I was raped by an African-American fraternity boy whom I was dating during my first year of college, and again after I was sexually assaulted by a near stranger in my college study abroad program in Kenya. Years later, after struggling with an eating disorder, contemplating suicide, and going to intensive therapy, I poured out all my anger and heartache in my poem, Do You Know What Rape Feels Like? As I retold my trauma, I leaned directly on Walker's words. Midway through my poem, I began in great detail to break down the intimate horror of my rape. Do you know what it feels like to have our howl silenced by a fist? When you are rushed into, pressed down on, and opened by a knife. A blade so thick, so strong, so brilliant, that your insides no longer exist. Your scraped against insides bleed out into a yell that only you and others like you can hear. Screaming until it stops. No, until you think it stops, and then from nowhere, from no one, it keeps on. He continues to destroy your petals with his, you don't even want to say it. I broke my silence because of The Color Purple. At every stage of my healing, I found something new in the novel, unseen themes or turns of phrases that I ignored in my previous visits. When my sister asked if she could document my healing with her camera, I handed my poem over to her. A few months later, when she adapted her photographs and my story into the stage performance Story of Rape Survivor, our actress, Rachel Walker, gave life to my words and let Celie's words be her creative guide. If Celie gave voice to my rape in my teens and early 20s, it was Shug in her bodiness and bodily confidence, whom I needed in my 30s as I entered a belated phase of sexual exploration. And among the pantheon of Black women characters whom I introduced to my students when I first started teaching at the University of Pennsylvania, Shug meant the most to me. Her sexual fluidity and unabashed desires gave me permission to experiment unapologetically with men and women and long for more. Now I live differently with The Color Purple. A lot more healed, yet still tender, I revel in Sophia's anger. Her rage at being doubly oppressed as Black and woman fuels me as I raise and protect my Black children, a 5-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl, in our age of unbridled racism. In the book, but especially on screen and on stage, Sophia captures my attention and dares me to be more like her. This is why every time I pick up the novel, even the one I teach from, covered by pastel stickies with its dog-eared pages, I feel as if it is for the very first time, finding and falling in love with a new moment that somehow I missed before. I try not to carry the enormousness of the novel's meaning for me when I finally met Alice Walker. I wasn't sure if I should remain professionally detached and not disclose my own experiences with sexual assault, or if I should tell her that I've read every poem, essay, short story, and novel that she'd published since 1970, and that she, more than any artist I discovered before or after her, gave me permission as a Black woman to be a full-fledged feminist. I was so afraid that my euphoria would spill out or that I'd fumble. But when my sister and I approached her haiku-inspired house standing at the top of the hill, with only a bunch of periwinkles standing between us and her. I did not hug Alice or thank her for writing the book that made my healing possible. Instead, I put on my writer's cap, introduced my sister as a photographer, and began to take notes. Gone were Alice's long locks. Now a short silver mane crowned her head, and she walked with an unbelievable lightness. And when she took us out back to the out on the back porch of Temple Juke, the name that she used for her house in our email correspondences, we, 3 Black women, stood silently together. Alice on the verge of her 75th birthday, Scheherazade, a newly minted 40-year-old, and I, a month into my 44th year, looked out to see only a crescendo of mountains standing between us and the horizon. After a minute, a deep inhale, and with a wry smile on her face, Walker asked, "Why do we need heaven when we have this?" And when I turned my head to catch her question, I realized that Alice Walker was the freest Black woman I'd ever met. I'll stop there.
That was so beautiful, Salamisha. Thank you. I loved hearing you reading in your own voice. I am going to, we're going to talk a little bit, but I realized I did not thank anyone who's responsible for bringing you here. So I'm just going to take a second to thank Mark Schell and his great work, keeping things going, our student assistant, Noah, the Department of English, the DePaul Women's Center, the Center for Black Diaspora, and African and Black Diaspora Studies are co-sponsors. So I would be distracted as well as remiss if I didn't say that right up front. So, and thanks of course to you, Salamisha, for being here, beaming in, and for everyone in the audience for being here. So, so that line that you ended your reading on, Alice Walker is the freest Black woman I've ever met, was the line that I pulled out for my first question, because I was just thinking about all of those ways that freedom is so precarious right now, and has always been historically. And I thought maybe we could use it as a jumping off point for talking about the ways that the color purple speaks to this moment that we're in right now for you. And yeah, just kind of thinking about some of the things that I know that you go into in your book as well.
So I guess the question of her being free and what that looks like, and then how do I think of the color purple in this particular moment? Well, I think for me with the freedom with Alice, right after that, I go into a section in which I invoke Zora Neale Hurston's "Their Eyes Were Watching God," and the character Janie. And Janie returns back home at the end of the book, wearing her overalls and her hair, her braids still hanging. And there's a sense of freedom. And Hurston, I'm going to paraphrase it here, but this idea of being able to tell one's story on one's own terms, being a sort of a definition of freedom that she gives throughout the book, but also very much at the end. And I think when I saw Alice, I was like, after, if you go through the story of the color purple and Alice Walker's remarkable experience, both being highly celebrated as an author, she wins the Pulitzer, she wins the National Book Award, and then when the book becomes a movie, it's nominated for 11 Oscars. And so in that period, there's a lot of ways in which Alice Walker's vision for freedom, for Celie's arc of self-revelation, defining sexuality on her own terms, healing from her sexual trauma, all of that gets celebrated to a certain degree in these in terms of the awards, but then she also gets so attacked for these representations. And so I thought that here I'm meeting this woman who won her friend Beverly Guy Sheftall, the wonderful Black feminist scholar and administrator at Spelman, describes Alice as the most hated Black woman in America when the book and the movie come out. And so just to see her in her own context and on land, and she bought 40 acres of land that she lives on top of, and to see her have gone through all of that and then create such a long-lasting tradition of Black Southern writing, of Black women's writing. I mean, it was pretty remarkable. And I was all like anxious. So in contrast to me, and we're in her home, but also there's a sense of, if you follow her career in terms of her spiritual path, there's a sense of calm and solidness that comes with Alice Walker. And so just to see all that at once was pretty remarkable for me, but also, what does it mean to be unencumbered? What does it mean to have defied the odds, but also defined life on the terms that you would like to live, and redefined an entire canon of African American and American literature? I mean, all of that struck me in that moment. And so, I don't know, we were looking over these ranges. I thought, wow, like I don't know her, but I also now understand, this is what I was thinking at the time. I don't know her, but I understand parts of her journey and what she survived. And so to see her just stand there was pretty stunning. In terms of the way in which the book, I think, resonates with me today, I think if, I started this book before we went through a global pandemic. And while we were in the age of Me Too and Black Lives Matter, but I finished the book in 2020. And so we're in this space of a deep introspection, I think, and an insistence that we need to heal. And there are few books that I think have given us the arc of healing as clearly as The Color Purple. And so I find that in this moment, if there's something new that we can learn from The Color Purple, it's Celie's evolution and Celie's transformation, but also the way in which Alice Walker kind of gives us all these stages of healing and redemption through Celie's own desire to connect with others, the relationship she has with Shug, her sisterhood with Nettie, her friendship with Sophia, and then ultimately her reconciliation with Albert. In all of those different relationships, we are given this amazing trajectory of being a rape victim to what I would call a survivor, but even more than that, to defining her relationship. She only can write to God at the beginning of the book. And by the end of the book, she's redefined God as an entity that lives in everything and everyone. I mean, that's a remarkable transformation for a character to go through. And, for us in this moment to learn from Celie's journey would be pretty remarkable. And to learn from Albert's journey, I think, would teach us really crucial lessons about atonement, about reparations, and about seeking forgiveness for the harm one has caused today. So
that's really beautiful, and it makes so much sense. Even in my my conversations with my class, my students were really, and some of them are here, were really excited about the spiritual potential of the book, and it really spoke to them. It's for an LGBTQ writers of color class, and so many of them were kind of articulating just feeling shut out of the religious and spiritual traditions of their families of origin, and that it was exciting to see a character wrestling with these same questions that they also felt and offering this other potentiality. So I can really see that for sure. So you cast such a wonderful net of interlocutors, I guess, over the course of your book. Including yourself, of course, and Alice Walker, your own family, like the photographs themselves might be thought of as that, but these amazing, admirable figures, Gloria Steinem and Beverly Guy Sheftall, Quincy Jones, Oprah, and I just was really interested in thinking about how what kinds of decisions did you make in terms of how to integrate all these voices and still kind of keep the center, a center of the book itself and its kind of changing place. So I guess more a
Yeah,
writing question.
yeah, no, that's a really thank you for that question. I mean, I think I knew that I wanted the book to become a character, or at least treat the book as if, I think, is it Janet? One of the people who endorsed the book described it as like a living being, or I don't know if maybe it's Gloria in the forward. And I knew I wanted you, the reader, to feel as if The Color Purple, the story of Celie in its various iterations, was like a family member or like someone you knew, or like kin. And so so I knew I wanted to achieve that, but I also, as I was writing it, and I had the opportunities to, Rebecca Mead is a journalist at the New Yorker, but she wrote a book on Middlemarch. And so I remember speaking to her, and My Life in Middlemarch is the name of the book. And it was helpful because she talked about, like, in her book, she always had Middlemarch, George Eliot, herself. There was one other thing, as they had to be there each time, and sometimes they would change in the hierarchy of what was given more attention, but they all had to be present in each chapter. And so for me, I think, when I broke the book up into the first section is Celie, and that's about the making of the novel. The second section is Shug, and that's about the movie. And the third section is Sophia, which is about the musical. I knew that each of those texts had to be a character, right? Then I also knew that I am a character in it. And then I also knew that the characters, right, like whether it's Celie or Shug or Sophia, also had to dominate. So those are the three things I was thinking about constantly, and making sure that they're present and in each chapter. I didn't originally, when I wrote the proposal for the book, it was the sections were broken down, like it was like mother, daughter, sister, something. It was a three-part structure, but somewhere along the way I was like, oh wait, it actually makes more sense to have Celie as like the book part, right? How does Alice come to write this book? Like, what's the struggle she goes through? And in a way, Celie kind of represents that. And then the second part, when the movie comes out, it is Shug that causes such controversy, right? Like, people are boycotting, people are threatening to ban the books. Alice Walker has to cross the picket line to go to her own film, right? Like, and so it was Shug that, part of it was the incest narrative, but part of it was that she dared to give Celie the ability to see herself and to define her sexuality through this relationship with Shug. I mean, that was a radical intervention. It was and next to Loving Her, it was the second time that we'd seen a Black lesbian character in American literature. But it was the first time we'd seen such a loving relationship between two Black women in American literature, and then on film. So, now that is completely more commonplace. But then it was such a radical departure. And so she was highly penalized for that. And then by the time I got to the musical, when I saw it, I was like, well, Sophia looks really different than Oprah looked in the movie. There's something about her that Nettie, Celie's sister, recedes in the background, and Sophia emerges as part of the trio. And that was my instinct when I saw the musical. And then when I was able to talk to Scott Sanders, the producer, there was a need to push Sophia's story, because it's such a powerful story of resistance and refusal, that the writers of the musical actually, they were like, when are we going to get to Sophia? Like, they sped up the story a little so they could introduce Sophia. And so that my instinct watching it was like, oh, that's interesting. But then when I did the interviews, I actually found that to be true. So that was what I was thinking about in that section. So yeah, I think I answered your question, but I got the details of it. But the last thing I would say is that writing about Alice Walker, she writes so well of herself, meaning that she has a book on the movie. She has essays on writing The Color Purple. So she's a very thoughtful, introspective writer. So I was able to pull from lots of material in order to recreate Alice Walker at her various stages of her journey with The Color Purple. I was able to capture that. So I have the 75-year-old Alice Walker, and then I also have like a 18-year-old Alice Walker. And to be able to give you all of that required me literally reading much of her work and then trying to imagine and channel those different stages of her identity and development.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I really love the section where you're really talking about Walker's self-care and her kind of careful curation of her own image, and that you really see the ways that she is protective of her image, but also really kind of creating a self that she can kind of stand behind, and that's for you the distinction between, or maybe a crucial difference between Zora Neale Hurston, whose memory, and Hurston was incredibly productive and of course and creative and wore all these many hats, but died in obscurity. And it was really Walker herself, who got us thinking about her and taking her seriously again. So I really appreciate that move of thinking about Walker, the public figure, and her savvy, and also maybe thinking about that savvy as hard won, like kind of based on that experience of controversy. So you may have already answered this, but kind of thinking about all those controversies, thinking about the boycott, like really visible writers like Ishmael Reed or Spike Lee, who Spike's it's always getting out there on the line. Thinking about the people who've taken on Walker around a supposedly difficult image of Black men and Black male violence or incest or lesbian sexuality. Do you feel like, I know you've said that when you're teaching the book, you're aware of how those controversies would land differently, and yet so much about our current culture is still tapping into some of those tensions around suspicion of Black feminism, despite amazing multiple movements of Black feminism, and all these other kinds of ways, fears around homophobia or homophobia itself, all of these different ways that the controversies are still kind of with us. So if The Color Purple were published for the first time now, do you feel like it would awaken the same kind of public discourse that happened, in the 80s? Or how do you think it would look different?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot because I think I mean, the book would definitely land differently now because it created the possibility for us to have these conversations differently. Meaning that, with Me Too and Tarana Burke, Alice, and through the character of Celie, really gave us, and she took the hits quite, the public criticism was so, it's hard to reimagine. I mean, it's hard, you're in Chicago, and Chicago was like such the hotbed of so much of the criticism, even in my book, but it really was. I mean, Farrakhan did a special a sermon on The Color Purple, and he says at the end that we must kill the color purple. The New York Times did a story about Black people basically fighting over the color purple, and it's set in Chicago, this conversation, these debates. And then I had the opportunity of interviewing Danny Glover, who plays the Mr. Albert character in the movie, and he was in Chicago. Yeah, there's an Arthur Fugard play that I forgot the name of it right now, but that he was performing in right when the movie came out. So he was like, he could feel the intensity. He was part of those conversations about why this story was an important story to be told, and why he felt that he wanted to deliver the character Mr. with the legitimacy, authenticity, and sincerity. So it's hard to completely understand what was at stake in those debates because we're in a different moment. You can see glimmers of it though around something like the R. Kelly, the resistance to believing that R. Kelly was a perpetrator for so long, the resistance of believing that someone like Bill Cosby was a perpetrator for so long, and yet now we're in a moment where we can see that as possible, and what was formerly a dividing line, right? Like the Black women and girls, or Black men and boys who came forward with their stories of sexual violence, were seen as traitors. And now I think we're seeing a shift of the people who have done the harm as being working against racial liberation and working against racial freedom. But that shift is really, like you're saying, quite new and not fully complete. So yeah, if the book came out now, though, I think the questions or the concerns or the anxiety, the kind of panic that it created in the 80s, it wouldn't generate that, but it would, in terms of both, I would say, like, Shug and Seeley, and Alice writes another novel after The Color Purple that becomes her epic novel. And Shug and Seeley, we see them in their old age, these two Black women living and loving each other. And so it's, she's imagining all of these possibilities before we have Me Too, before we have marriage equality. And yet I always find that it's the figure of Albert, to me, that intrigues me the most in this moment, because we've still yet to see a figure who has abused people try to publicly go through that process of redemption and atonement, and to give Albert those characteristics, to give him that character arc, was pretty remarkable, because we can see him go from someone who literally like abuses a teenage Seeley upon marriage to, at the end of the novel, he's asking for her hand in marriage. And of course, like, that's never going to happen, but that he had gone through such a tremendous journey of trying to heal, but also to redeem himself in the eyes of those he harmed. And that takes a lot of bravery, humility, and a sense that you're part of something larger than yourself. And in a moment where we're still reeling from the last presidency, from January 6th insurrection, what does accountability look like? What does it look like to repair harm that's been done in the past? I mean, these are all questions that we still have to grapple with as a people and as a country.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, I have monopolized the conversation for too long. I'm going to open things up and encourage folks, if they would like, to put their questions in the chat. And I'm going to turn things over to Megan Heffernan, to Professor Heffernan, who's going to help curate the conversation.
So we're still waiting for people to get their thoughts together, and we, pop them in the chat whenever you're ready. Or if you prefer to unmute yourself and come on mic, you can do that as well, whatever you're more comfortable with. I guess I will say I had not read The Color Purple before we were bringing you to campus, and I thought I must read this. And I did not read it in one day, but I read it in 3 nights, which is kind of amazing in the middle of the term. And so I think the question I have for you while we're waiting for people to pop thoughts into the chat might be about genre. So the question that Francesca just asked was about sort of the moment this book came out in the 80s. I think I'm curious. So, and I totally hear what you're saying about perhaps there might be a different reception of it now. I'm also curious if there could be what cultural artifact could do that work for us in the year of 2020 or 2021 or 2025, or would it be a novel, or what other kind of sort of center of gravity could spin out all these other or spin it or generate sort of all these other cultural productions that do this important work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one, I mean, thank you. I have a chapter on not just the writing of the book, but the way in which she insists on privileging the voice of a Southern Black girl who's growing up in segregation, quite literally not just privileging her vantage point and her point of view, but how she speaks. And so that was really, again, a radical intervention to make in the American novel. So she's influenced, of course, by Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, in which you see elements of that, right? So Skip Gates, who was Henry Louis Gates, who was my advisor in grad school, writes about this in his book Signifying Monkey. And he talks about when you're reading Their Eyes Were Watching God, it starts off in the traditional third person narrative style, and then midway through it slips in free indirect discourse. It slips into the language of Janie's consciousness, and then by the end we're back to this third person narrator. And so for Alice Walker, then he writes about Alice Walker being in the tradition of and signifying on Hurston, but grounding her entire novel in the voices of these two Black women who are writing letters across time and to each other, but really, really valuing Seeley's voice, a voice that was seen as something that Essence magazine, for example, rejects Alice's, it rejects, well, she sends it in for excerpt submission and they reject it. They say, Black people don't talk like that. And Essence had published earlier works of hers, but in this moment, there's something about reading Seeley's speech patterns, which was considered offensive. So you have all these things going on. You have the incest narrative and the sexual violence. You have the queer relationship between Seeley and Sophia, and then you have Black vernacular, Southern Black vernacular being prioritized and privileged. And so that was just a confluence of so many different things at once. So I did an interview recently, and someone did ask me, is there some text that, that recently came out that maybe has this kind of seismic shifting, like these kind of seismic shift, it was a seismic shifting event. And I did have to leave the novel and go to something, I think I've said Beyonce's Lemonade, right? Like that you have this kind of visual storytelling of the multiplicity of Black women's identity. Again, you have another Southern Black woman artist really grappling with the larger narrative of Black womanhood, but also having the specificities of the South, of her own complicated sexual, not that it's the way that, Alice is much more radical, I think, in terms of sexual desire and sexual exploration and Black women's sexuality than Beyonce is, but I do think there's something so attractive and compelling about what Beyonce was doing with Lemonade, and yet it still didn't get recognized the way it should have in its own time. So there's a complexity there. But I do wonder if, well, the question I guess too is, what is it about The Color Purple that allows it or leads to so many different genre explorations, movie, musical, and now musical movie, and the timelessness of Seeley. But I think there's something about maybe that epistolary framework, those letter writing frameworks that are so inviting to us as readers that then allow people to imagine it being adapted in other forms, as even at the moment that the letter writing format has to kind of go away for you to make a movie or tell a story on stage or something like that. So I don't know, it's just an inviting text. And I think the letter writing, the epistolary framework does more than just invite you in. It creates a kind of connection to the story that then allows it to be genre bending, I suppose.
I love that thought, especially the formulation letters across time. That's so great. So we do have some questions. Yay, some questions coming in now. So I think I'll start at the top from Jane. Oh, no, one more up. Cecilia Kearney. Did Zora Neale Hurston's research methods when writing her own books influence your writing process? So perhaps you've thought about this a bit in thinking about Alice Walker's sort of response to Hurston, but I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
I don't know if Zora's process affected me as much as Alice's quest to understand Zora affected my quest to understand Alice. So she writes an essay in, again, I'm so about years, in the 1970s, that she publishes in Ms. Magazine called Looking for Zora, in which she goes to Florida, and and Francesca talked about this to a certain degree, and she's deeply saddened to discover that there are no markings. There's no way to memorialize Hurston. There's no grave, there's no tombstone. And so she ends up buying one But the whole story is about the way in which Hurston, who was so important in her time, has been relegated to obscurity and dies as a domestic and penniless. And so, Walker, in many ways, is responsible for the revival of Zora Neale Hurston, who now is canonical for us, but in the 70s had to be revived. So I think, I write, my first introduction is called Looking for Alice, and so it's playing with that. But what I found in the process of writing this book and meeting Alice, but also just being in her archive at Emory, is that she was so different than Hurston. Like, we always, in literary criticism, and both Skip Gates and Signifying Monk that I've already mentioned, but oftentimes see them as sisters or daughter and mother. And Alice sees herself as distinct from Hurston, paid tribute to, but not like. And I would say that in terms of Alice having the privilege and also the ability to keep all of this material and live on 40 acres and have these adaptations exist, that she isn't like Hurston, right? That she has made sure that she does not die in obscurity. And that's a kind of willful insistence on being remembered. And also, when I asked her that question of, did you know someone like me would always come along? Of course, she doesn't know I'm going to come along, but that she says something like she wanted to create a map for that person. And that's different than Hurston, but it's because of Hurston that I think she recognizes this sense of creating a lineage and also creating legacy.
Yeah, I was going to say creating a tradition, but like tying tradition to lineage, right? Like putting those two together. That's great. So the next question is from Jane, who says, from your personal experiences or simply current events, how do you feel that the color purple could resonate to the Black man in America?
Oh, well, that's a great question. I think that it resonates, and not just because of the character of Albert, but I do know in the musical that the figure of Harpo is someone. So Harpo in the book is Sophia's husband, is Albert's son, and he's the character who doesn't necessarily have the same growth because he actually doesn't start off in the same place of inflicting harm quite the way that Albert does, but he does represent a modern man in the story. He's like Sophia's a modern woman who rejects categorization. You have this figure of Harpo who's really trying to define his identity beyond the trauma that his father has experienced and that his grandfather has inflicted. And so you have this really beautiful character who does harm his wife at points, but then also they reunite, and it's a beautiful love. Next to Celie and Shug, Sophia and Harpo's love story is remarkable. And those two are based on Alice's parents, right? So she infused the figure of Sophia with the characteristics of her mother, and she infused Harpo with the characteristics of her father. So I find Harpo to be such a beautiful character. And what I understand of the movie that's being made is that it's in many ways trying to give Harpo space, because he represents, I think, a Black masculinity that's complicated, that's contradictory, but that's modern in a way that I think can resonate with many people today.
I want to see this, the musical movie when it's out.
Yeah, me too. I don't know. I'm sure it'll be. And also, just for people who are like Beyonce fans, I guess, the director of Black King, whose name I can't remember, Bars, I forgot his last name. He's the one who's directing the Color Purple musical. So I mean, it all is like, I'm not just bringing up Beyonce, but there's like connections here.
It's gonna be awesome. So let's see, we have a question from Adamaris. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. For someone who hasn't read The Color Purple, which you actually are gonna really have to go do now because it's just so amazing, I promise. But the question is, for someone who hasn't read The Color Purple or watched the film, how would you recommend they go into it in terms of mindset and analysis?
Yeah, well, if you're in this conversation, you got a lot of tools to help you. So I would say that you know that it starts off with a scene of trauma, that there's no embellishment. And Alice Walker makes that decision to start the book at that moment of violation from Celi's point of view, because she didn't want us to be seduced by Pa. She didn't want the person who was inflicting the harm to become, and that's so much of like, you know, how we've read, we tend to read these experiences in literature, how we've seen them on film, that either they're objective, which still means valuing the voice of and the vantage point of the perpetrator, or they're told from the perpetrator's point of view. She didn't want to do any of that. She wanted us to sit with Celi's trauma. And then what's remarkable about the book is that by doing so, we can appreciate, as I've said before, that that journey in a way that we wouldn't have, I think, if she had made different decisions. I don't know if anyone's seen Promising Young Woman, the film that's out now, but there are ways in which that film kind of plays with point of view. I don't want to give too much away about the film, but it's a film that is trying to push back against the dominant narratives that we've been given about sexual assault by playing with point of view, by playing with narrative, whose point of view that we're going to hear the story from, but also it literally plays with so many genres of film and how sexual violence has been portrayed in film. So it's an interesting piece, and I wrote a thing in the New York Times about, it was a piece on Albert from The Color Purple, but I opened with Promising Young Woman. So I think, you know, these are ways in which the stories continue to resonate today, whether we know it or not. I think The Color Purple has influenced so much of how we tell these stories about sexual violence. But anyway, I think if you read The Color Purple, just know that it starts difficult in a difficult place, but that's the journey to wholeness. I think the payoff is it's worth it.
Yeah, we have a Nina is telling us how amazing A Promising Young Woman is. So I think I've heard this too, so I'm going to have to see it. If we have time, we have 1 minute left for one last question, if that might be okay. And it's from Liv, and she asks, what do you think it is about this story in particular that makes it transferable to so many different forms, novel, musical, film? And how do these forms change or distort the story? So what kind of center of gravity does the musical exert that might be different than the novel or the film, I guess that's a super interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful question. And I think part of the challenge of each of those iterations, once you get past the novel, I would say. So one, just quickly, Alice Walker did write a script to be adapted into a film. They didn't end up going with that, but she was the original screenwriter for the film. And in that version of her screenplay, Shug is a much bigger character than she wasn't even in the book. And so by the time it ends up being the Spielberg version, Shug is reduced, not simply from the book, but what Alice imagined her to be. And the relationship between Shug and Celi is more implied than explored. So that was difficult for Alice to see. And yet, I thought it was important to show not only how controversial the relationship, even in its reduced form, was, but how inspiring it was for an artist like Elaine Thomas, who sees the film when she's a teenager and she goes with her mother. And in that moment, there's a possibility. She's understanding her own desires, and she sees these two women kiss on screen, and she realizes a possibility for herself. And so Elaine Thomas is a well-known visual artist who has a series of paintings based on The Color Purple. So even in the moments in which things aren't quite the way they should be, even in the conservative versions of The Color Purple, there's still possibility for a radical imagination of self. And so then the musical, I think, is the same thing happens. Like, I saw the musical and I was like, I didn't see it on Broadway, right? So, like, I'm writing about it, but I didn't see it on Broadway. And so I saw it as a touring production. And at first I was like, oh man, like, this is not like Celi's trauma, like, it's not as like, I don't feel it the same way like I do in the book or the movie. And, in this age of Me Too, like, what does it mean to lose all of that? And the musical format, it's very difficult to do sadness in a musical, right? Like, that's just not how the American, it's not opera where that's like the dominant, you know, expression. It is, musicals are assumed to be kind of triumphant and feel good. And so despite that, you still have this story of The Color Purple. And so I think that was for me why I wanted to look at how Albert had transformed, because even again, in this version that is not as heavy or as demanding emotionally as the book is, you do see another character given space to grow and breathe. And then there's two versions of the musical. So the second version by Jonathan Doyle is much more, they kind of got rid of the elaborate set. They shortened the songs by about 30 minutes. And so it's closer to the novel. So the different forms do give us different versions of Color Purple, and the different forms emerge in their own moment. And we respond to them in the moment that we're in based on our needs and our desires in the present. But they also reflect those needs and desires. So that's been such, I'm curious. I mean, I think the musical movie will be dealing with questions of Black masculinity in an even more complicated way, as well as trying to figure out what Celie's story is for us in this second decade of the second decade, yeah, the 21st century.
Yeah, who knows when it is anymore. I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm going to go buy your book. I will ask.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask everyone to thank Professor Tillet, and then also turn things over to Francesca, if you have, in case you have any last words to send us on our way.
No, I'm just so excited, and yeah, I just want to keep talking. But I know that you have places to go.
My children that you've heard.
Children to feed or that. So I just am so grateful for this conversation. It's really feeding me a lot, and I'm grateful, of course, to Salamishah, to all of you for being here, our co-sponsors, and yeah, and everyone who's helped make this happen. So thanks again. And I would say have a great flight, Salamishah, but I guess I don't have to say that because you're home,
No,
which is nice.
I'm home.
But
Yes.
thanks
Well,
again.
thank you all for having me. This was so rejuvenating. So thank you.
Same here. Have a good night.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye.